70% of journalists have lost their jobs over the last 2 decades. 3,300 newspapers have closed. On average, we're still losing 2 newspapers a week. I mean, the data is clear and striking. And yet, at the same time, there has been undoubtable energy, entrepreneurialism, and real sense of purpose from communities and news entrepreneurs across the country who are really building new models. And I think there has not been enough attention on them.
This is Small Press, Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gewirtz. Small Press Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Okay, today on the podcast, I am joined by Sarabeth Berman. She is the Chief Executive Officer at the American Journalism Project, whose purpose is to catalyze a new generation of public service media that is sustained by, governed by, and looks like the public it serves. So, Sarabeth, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here.
Yeah. I kind of always start the podcast. I just like to just hear a bit about your background, your professional background, and your story in journalism, media, local media, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, sure. I've had a really winding path to this role. I'm not a journalist by trade. I started my career in China. I first worked for a modern dance company in China. I had grown up in the performing arts, and I was really interested in the performing arts, both because I loved the arts, but also because I loved the act of doing something much bigger than yourself and bringing people together. And that work led me to helping to build Teach for China. They had just launched. It was a team of Americans and Chinese entrepreneurs who were trying to replicate the Teach for America model in China and adapt it. And I helped them build that organization. Along the way, I met my husband, who's a journalist. He was a foreign correspondent in China when we were living there, and got really pulled into the journalism community, particularly the foreign correspondent community. We were there in the lead up to the Olympics in 2008 and right after, when there was the financial crisis. And we felt firsthand the contractions in the newspaper industry. Most of our colleagues closed down their bureaus and went home. My husband, who at the time was there with the Chicago Tribune, which at the time was one of the great American regional newspapers, had a Beijing bureau. He, took the plaque off the wall of that bureau, sent it home to the editors, closed down that bureau. He ended up staying and working for the New Yorker magazine there, but we felt the really anemic foreign press corps there, which was happening because we were seeing the early signs of the crumbling of the industry. And this was notable both because of that fact that we were starting to see how much the newspaper industry was struggling financially. But it was also noticeable because in China, the press is really an extension of the government. And so the foreign press plays a uniquely important role because it's governed by the values of a free press. We moved back to the U.S. in 2013, I took a role working for a woman named Wendy Kopp, who founded Teach for America and later Teach for All, which is a network of organizations around the world that is trying to replicate and adapt and scale the Teach for America model in vastly different contexts all over the world, from Nepal to Bulgaria to Peru. And we were working to help these organizations grow, to help them learn from each other. And I learned a lot about what it looks like to build successful nonprofit organizations and how to help organizations learn from each other and grow together, which is what ultimately led me to this role, which I took on in 2020. The American Journalism Project got launched in 2019 by two co-founders, late John Thornton, who passed away earlier this year, the founder of the Texas Tribune, and Elizabeth Green, who was the co-founder of Chalkbeat, which is now part of a larger network of newsrooms, Chalkbeat, VoteBeat, and HealthBeat, all under the Civic News Company umbrella. And both of them had started to see the promise of the nonprofit model and the ways in which these mission-oriented organizations were finding their footing, both in terms of serving audiences, but also in terms of building strong business models. And they wanted to scale that and replicate that across the country. I knew Elizabeth from the education world. She was covering education. I was working in the education world. And she was the one who identified that the skills and capabilities that we'd built at Teach for All were going to be really helpful in this sector. And so she recruited me to become the first CEO of the American Journalism Project. So I stepped into the role. I accepted the job in February 2020, stepped into the role in March 2020. And so it was a really dramatic moment for the country, for the world, and of course, specifically for local news. And so that's my winding path to this work of local news.
Awesome. And you spoke eloquently on kind of the founding and the mission of the American Journalism Project. So could you talk a little bit maybe about your day-to-day and also just what the organization, like what initiatives you're doing, like what the group is actually doing?
Yeah, sure. So we got launched in response to the crisis in American local news across the country, what we've come to identify as a market failure, a systemic market failure. The business model that worked for a century and a half has crumbled, and the consequences of that erosion has been really well documented. And certainly listeners of this podcast know it better than ever, the ways in which local news, the erosion of local news has contributed to decrease in civic engagement, decrease in voter participation, the accountability function local news plays in communities, but also the really important role the erosion of local news has played in polarizing our country. And so for all these reasons, we've really come to believe we need to regard local news as a public good. And that means building business models that are responsive to that fact. And so that's why we've been so focused on building and accelerating the growth of the nonprofit local news sector across this country. There had been this emerging really movement of new nonprofit news organizations that were digital, that were calling upon philanthropy, upon readers, upon companies as sponsors to build strong business models and deliver local news to their communities. And we were established to accelerate that. And so what that looks like is we call ourselves a venture philanthropy. So we raise philanthropic dollars at the national level, meaning we're going to philanthropists who are concerned about this challenge all across the country. And we are then investing in nonprofit news organizations across the country, both to grow existing news organizations and to help seed and launch new news organizations. And our focus is primarily on the business model. And the reason is because we see the fundamental problem we're trying to solve is the business model problem. And so our investments, we call them investments, they're philanthropic grants. We make multi-year grants to organizations. They're all on the business and operational side of the organization. So we don't fund journalism. We fund the business, revenue, product, audience teams that help you support and sustain excellent journalism in communities. And then in addition to the dollars, we also have a team that's working on the strategies and technical support necessary to help build excellent businesses, to grow your revenue across those revenue streams I described earlier, to grow your philanthropic revenue stream, to grow your reader revenue stream, to grow your corporate sponsorship revenue stream, to grow your events business, if that makes sense for your organization. And so we're really helping organizations build their capacity, both in terms of hiring teammates, but also in terms of building the capacity of those teams to deliver on the promise of these investments, which is to grow the revenue of your organization, to build a stronger organization, and then to ultimately be able to hire more journalists as a result of that. So our team is really focused on that. We also have a whole team that's focused on seeding and launching new news organizations, in addition to funding the emerging founders across the country who have launched organizations. We're also helping to launch new organizations. We work with local philanthropy, so markets across the country where civic leaders or local philanthropists in those communities are very concerned about the state of local news in their market, but don't know exactly what to do about it, but know there is a problem and know that philanthropic dollars could be useful, but don't know how to deploy them in a way that will really meaningfully move the needle on this problem. And so we've developed a team that does market research, does community listening, and does what we call solution design to really develop a solution for how philanthropy could be deployed in that market. And in some markets, that has led to the seeding and launching of new news organizations. Like in Ohio, we helped to launch Signal Ohio, which is in Cleveland. In Akron, has a Columbus newsroom, statewide newsroom, and then is hoping to expand in Cincinnati and has started to do that work as well. We helped to launch Free Press Indiana, which is a nonprofit organization in Indiana that launched its first outlet in Indianapolis called Mayor Indy and is hoping to expand across more rural markets in Indiana. We helped to launch the Tulsa Flyer, which is just launched just several weeks ago in Tulsa. And we have a news organization coming down the pike in LA called the LA Local, which is expanding the very successful Boyle Heights Beat, which is a nonprofit newsroom that covers East LA, really beloved, really trusted by its community. And they're replicating that hyper-local model in more markets across LA. So we've used that approach to help also propel forward the nonprofit news field.
That's great. I love the idea. I've never heard that before of venture philanthropy. It's I had Stephen Waldman on here, and I hope I'm not misquoting another guest. I think it was him that said that for your local media orgs that, for-profits need to act a little bit more like nonprofits and vice versa. Nonprofits need to act a little bit. So that's a great example of like an organization like yours taking a book out of the ultimate for-profit model, the venture back. And that's a really great way to kind of describe how it works and everything. That's great.
Yeah, you often hear people say, look, nonprofit is not a business model, which is 100% accurate. Nonprofit is a tax status. It is an orientation. It's a mission-driven orientation. And it allows you to tap into philanthropy as one revenue stream. But we also know there are many other revenue streams that are available to local news. It's just about building strong business models to be able to sustain that, building journalism products that communities really look to, trust, need, and then building out the teams to activate the revenue for that.
Yeah, agreed. There's a lot of great reasons to go the nonprofit route. I had Joe Coughlin on the podcast just today. It actually went live. He runs The Record North Shore in North Chicago.
Great.
And he basically, his kind of take from what I remember, is pretty fresh because I just talked to him, was they went the nonprofit route right out of the gate because they can't take political dollars. And, highly politicized country we live in right now, it's, best not to polarize anybody. So we can't even touch that. It's like written into the rules of the book and everything. So you talked a little bit about how you were in China in the financial crisis, I think you said, and kind of saw the industry going anemic, I think is the term you used, and the industry in decline. And this podcast is pretty focused on local news. And so I saw a post you put up, I believe, on LinkedIn last week that said, the underlying story of rebirth in local news has been overlooked, crowded out by headlines focused on crisis and collapse. And I totally agree. I think that is what's happened. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that rebirth and why you think that the doom and gloom narrative has stuck around for so long, even if there are, green shoots coming up and, there is stuff happening if you're looking at the space.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think there's a lot of reasons why it's happened and why I really hope the tide will shift and why I do in some ways see it shifting. I mean, one is it is a reality that over the last 2 decades, the industry, the commercial newspaper industry in particular, but the news industry in general, has really struggled. People who listen to this podcast know the stats better than anyone, but 70% of journalists have lost their jobs over the last 2 decades. 3,300 newspapers have closed. On average, we're still losing 2 newspapers a week. I mean, the data is clear and striking. And yet, at the same time, there has been undoubtable energy, entrepreneurialism, and real sense of purpose from communities and news entrepreneurs across the country who are really building new models. And I think there has not been enough attention on them. And I think that's happening, one, because in general, there's, an old adage in journalism, you don't cover the planes that are taking off, you cover the planes that crash. I think in general, there tends to be an orientation towards covering problems, and it is particularly close to home for journalists because it is a problem happening in their own businesses that they're working in. And so we've had a huge amount of coverage of the challenges facing local news. But I also think, so therefore, it's been hard to see the stories of rebirth and the models that are working come through. And I think it's really important that it does for a few reasons. I mean, one is if we want capital, philanthropic capital, to flow into this space, people do not just fund problems, they fund solutions. They need to know that there are real solutions out there worth investing in, growing, replicating. And so elevating that work is really important. The other, of course, is a talent question. Having great talent in this sector is essential. I mean, the whole business is a people business. It's about great journalists who are collecting information, are out there asking questions, or writing stories, or developing storytelling formats to tell really important fact-based journalism for communities. We need really sophisticated entrepreneurs who are building these businesses, who are making the case to philanthropy in their communities, who are calling upon readers to give to news organizations, not just because they need the content, but because their community needs the content, who are figuring out smart ways to partner with businesses. This takes incredible talent, and talent needs to be attracted to a field that is growing and has a sense of mission and has a sense of purpose. And journalism, of course, has always really tapped into mission-driven individuals, but people want to know that they're a part of something that isn't dying. And so I think it's really important that we're uplifting the stories of potential, because we need a generation of great talent to continue to flow into this space. And then finally, I just think it is an accurate statement to say that there is a real notable amount of energy and transformation happening in this industry. More and more startups are emerging across the country. Many more philanthropic dollars are flowing into this space. We're seeing new kinds of collaboration, new kinds of dissemination of news, new kinds of storytelling, many kinds of news organizations that are really innovating on how we reach audiences, how we interact with communities, and how we disseminate journalism. And so for all those reasons, I think it's really important that these stories get elevated. In our portfolio, we're just seeing increasingly the ways in which this model is working. We're now 6 years in, and we're seeing the data. These organizations are growing. They're expanding into new markets. We fund, for instance, Vermont Digger, which has been around for now over a decade. They're continuing to expand across Vermont. We fund Outlier Media in Detroit, which has been innovating on how you distribute local news to Detroiters. A primary distribution mechanism for them is text message, because they found that was the best way to get into the hands of the readers who needed the news and information. We've funded many organizations that are figuring out expansion models, like Cityside in Northern California, which started in Berkeley and then expanded with Berkeley Side, expanded into Oakland with Oakland Side, have now expanded into Richmond with Richmond Side, and are figuring out how you build a model that can expand into more markets. Similarly, I know you had Warwick Sabin, the CEO of Deep South Today, on your podcast. Mississippi Today started in 2016, a bunch of journalists and philanthropists, now the largest newsroom in Mississippi. And then they've built this infrastructure to be able to expand across the Deep South with the launch of Verite in New Orleans. And they just merged in with The Current in Lafayette, Louisiana, and see the opportunity to keep expanding and supporting local news across the Deep South through this shared infrastructure and business model. So there's so many different examples of organizations that are really demonstrating what growth and rejuvenation can look like.
That's great. I'm going to pivot from my talking points a little bit, because you've talked about, I think you said earlier, the the main goal is to find the models that work. And it's come up a few times. I'm curious in terms of business models that are working from where you're sitting, what's working? Like what kind of like revenue generating activities are working, and also what hasn't worked that you've maybe experimented with? I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Boots on the ground, what you're seeing taking place out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the various revenue streams that are available to local news are we're seeing that are working. One is growing the pie of philanthropy. There is a huge amount of philanthropy in this country, and a very, very small portion of it goes to news. That makes sense. For a very long time, news was a wealth generator in this country. It was not a philanthropic priority. I think we are at the very front end of opening up the philanthropic door. And so that's one. I do think tapping into philanthropy is a huge opportunity, and in particular, local philanthropy. A significant portion of philanthropy in our country is tied to place. People who care about Tulsa, people who care about Cleveland, people who care about their home. And they're giving in their home to strengthen their communities. And those are natural stakeholders in the rejuvenation of local news. And it really is about making the case about why local news matters, how it affects the community, and then convincing those philanthropists to give. However, philanthropy is not the only solution to funding local news, and we certainly don't believe that. It is essential to get readers to give to local news. Of course, if people really believe that local news, if it's something that becomes a part of their lives, that they see that it matters, they will support it. We see this consistently. Public media paved the path on that. How do you make the case to people not just to give to your news organization because it's a transaction of a subscription, but also because you believe this is an important part of your community? And increasingly, we are seeing our portfolio is bucking the trends on audience. They're growing their audience, but they're also increasing the number of individuals who are giving relatively small amounts, but consistently monthly donations that shows up as durable revenue. So that's incredibly important. And there still is advertising revenue, of course. It's just far diminished from what it once was. It used to be about 80% of local news revenue, and now it has diminished tremendously, but there's still advertising revenue, and we need to work to capture every dollar of that. And there's new kinds of partnerships with companies. We signed a partnership with JP Morgan last year, in which they are both supporting the American Journalism Project's work, but they're also sponsoring 10 news organizations in our portfolio, and they have a sponsored content partnership where they're publishing financial management, financial planning stories that are relevant to the community. They're very clearly marked as sponsored by JP Morgan, but it's proving to be a smart revenue source for those news organizations. And so we see other opportunities to partner with companies. And then, of course, some of our news organizations are doing very successful event businesses. The Texas Tribune runs a festival called Trib Fest every year, which they do very well with, make millions of dollars from, and is an important part of their annual revenue. We see these different kinds of revenue, and I think the question for these different organizations is which of these revenue streams and which combination of these revenue streams is best suited for your community and the news organization you're building. There's no question that in the start of nonprofit news, a lot of the news organizations that started were small investigative news organizations. In fact, INN, which people know in our sector as the Institute for Nonprofit News, was called it was focused on investigative news originally. And we've found that just investigative news operations have trouble diversifying their revenue beyond philanthropy because it's hard to build a daily relationship with your audience if you're just publishing very infrequently. If you're only doing kind of hard-hitting investigative long-form journalism, which is so important, you aren't also becoming a part of kind of the daily fabric of people's lives. And so we've seen that of course, the journalism product that people create is important to what kind of revenue streams you can tap. And then also building those internal capabilities. Journalism didn't have to know how to fundraise. Now you do have to know how to fundraise. Now you do need to not only tell great stories about your community, but about why the work you're doing is important, and tell that consistently to your audience so that they continue to support it. So all of that knowledge is something that we're seeing a new generation of journalism organizations grow and build that set of knowledge and then share it amongst themselves. In terms of what doesn't work, there are definitely examples of it not working. If you don't build a product that is distinguished from what already exists in a market, that's a big problem. You can't just replicate what other news organizations are doing. You need to demonstrate your unique value. You need to be really focused on not just assuming because you're doing good work that the money will come. You have to be focused on actually building those revenue streams, learning how to fundraise, learning how to make the case and monetize to your audience and monetize your audience, learning how to build smart business partnerships and how to sell ads. So these organizations really do need to build that focus on the business as much as they focus on the journalism, which is why our program is so focused on that. And then, of course, as with any startup or business, you need to get the right talent in who has these skill sets or knows that they don't have these skill sets and can hire for them. And so often we see that so much of success lies in the hands of the leadership of these organizations. Do they have the right people around at the board level, at the leadership level, to really continue to build strong organizations and continue to adapt to a time of real change in this industry?
The idea of attracting talent has come up a few times in what you've been talking about. And, like the metaphor that comes to mind, you always hear, the greatest minds in the world that could be curing cancer and solving the climate are wind up getting hoovered up by a hedge fund in Connecticut to, make some arbitrage on a market or something like that. Not that that's what this industry is, but have you seen anybody doing a good job or anything you've seen for attracting really good? You said that you help put together revenue teams and audience teams and all that. Where are you finding people or your member organizations finding good talent and attracting them? And
talent's key, and that's true of any business, but it's particularly true of our business. There is some really great talent. I think journalism has always really been a mission-driven industry, and that is the number one reason why people do this work. They want to be part of the mission. And so that has been a very helpful way to be able to recruit people. We talk to a lot. Jelani Cobb, who's the dean of the Columbia Journalism School, is on our board. Graciela Machowski, who's the dean of Craig Newmark's CUNY School of Journalism, is one of our advisors. They have plenty of applicants. Young people do want to do this work, so there is talent flowing in. But in terms of building the business talent for these organizations, I do think there's a lot to be done to bring in folks from outside the industry. Many of our news organizations are looking to successful community nonprofits from other industries, museums, other community nonprofits that have been very successful in building support, and are recruiting them to come lead the revenue teams and fundraising teams at these organizations. That's really smart. We often say, you often hear people say in this industry, oh, there's not enough philanthropy to fund local news. I mean, I think there's real opportunity to tap into philanthropy. And it's really about just building the strength within these organizations to do that. And so bringing in talent from outside is something we're seeing people do. But so I think it's very important that these organizations are not just looking from within the news industry, but looking to other industries that have the insights in how you build community organizations, build trusting relationships with audiences. In LA, where we've helped to launch the LA Local, the new CEO, a woman named Michelle Siqueiros, it came from a hugely prominent education nonprofit in LA. She's really rooted in the LA community. She understands how to run an excellent nonprofit. And so she's a really unique set of skills to come to be paired with the excellent journalists that they're hiring to cover the community.
That's a great idea. I'm just looking at these kind of industries. Actually, my sister comes to mind. My sister is, she's a director of development for the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, which is a trail runs through the Rockies from Mexico to Canada. And I see jobs pop up on LinkedIn in this industry, and I'm always like, oh man, she'd be great at that. But she loves where she's at also. So, she's
okay. Well,
she's very
whenever
mission
she's
driven.
ready, we'll recruit her in.
Yeah. Hopefully she'll listen. She'll be like, what are you volunteering me for? No, I'm just kidding.
Right, exactly. No, but there's so many insights from consumer marketing, from many other industries that are figuring out how to navigate directly engaging audiences in this moment. And we need to be tapping into that.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm going to pivot into my obligatory AI question because it has to come up in every podcast episode about anything ever these days. But I'd just like to hear your overall thoughts on AI with this whole mission with local news. And also if you could talk a little bit about the HAP's product and AI studio, which I kind of saw on your website. I'd like to hear about what you're thinking there. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's no question that AI is going to transform the way we consume and really engage with, produce news and information. That became clear very early on as the kind of world woke up to this evolving technology, when ChatGPT launched. And I think, people outside of Silicon Valley realized that AI was here. We very quickly decided we need to figure out how these organizations we're working with are experimenting with these new technologies, figuring out the do's and don'ts, figuring out the ways in which it can support great journalism and the ways in which it needs to be mitigated so that it's not undermining great journalism. And so with that in mind, we ended up launching a team that we call our Product and AI Studio. Got support from OpenAI in the form of a grant with sort of no expectations other than supporting experimentation across our portfolio and trying to document that and share that. And also from an independent foundation called the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. We have a small team that's focused on making grants out to our portfolio to help them with AI experimentation, documenting what's working and sharing that learning. And then also where there's products that we think that news organizations are building that should be spread, trying to figure out how to spread those so that this new generation of news organizations continues to stay cutting edge in terms of how they're engaging with these new technologies. And so there are a lot of applications out there. We fund a great news organization in Puerto Rico called CPI, which has long struggled with how you effectively translate stories in a way that is not too cumbersome for the newsroom because translation tools are often so terrible and, as they say, not culturally competent. And so they worked to figure out how you use AI to translate in a way that is very, very good and then have an editor then read through it in a way that's manageable from a time perspective. And we worked with them to build out a toolkit on exactly how you prompt it to do that. And then in Los Angeles, where Boyle Heights Beat, which I mentioned earlier, was covering the fires, they really wanted to be disseminating in Spanish and English and used that guide to be able to disseminate their stories in both languages. We see news organizations using it to support on the revenue side of the organization, writing different appeals for different audiences, using it to make marketing kits in a much faster way than, a person could pre-AI. And we're also seeing news organizations use it in the kind of collecting of public information work. So there's so much government and public data out there that is hard for a small newsroom to go through comprehensively, and AI can be used in really smart ways to do that. In fact, we just published a guide where we audited many tools out there and shared kind of pros and cons of the tool, just to make it easier for newsrooms to be able to guide the proliferation of tools out there and guide them through deciding what makes sense for them. So our goal is to really help these small organizations and the field more broadly navigate this evolving technology when we know that the big media companies out there are investing a lot of resources into this. And so we want to make sure that across the country, we are seeing local news organizations figure out the ways to engage with this technology.
That's great. I'm glad that the American Journalism Project is doing that because it's just so overwhelming, AI. There's so much new stuff every day. It's great that there's kind of some resources like that you've put together. We're coming up on time, but I did want to get your take on, I've been asking everybody, if you flash forward 5 years and it's kind of an arbitrary number I picked, but what are your hopes and your predictions for kind of the state of local news, the way things are trending now? Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're going to have many more examples of excellent nonprofit news organizations that are serving as the primary source of original reporting in communities across the country. I think that increasingly, this is both my hope, but also what I believe will be true. I think people will both talk about the challenges facing the news industry and point to real solutions and examples of thriving organizations in one breath. They'll be talking about both. I think that we will see local news increasingly recognized as something that is a key pillar of a thriving community. And we'll see that measured through more philanthropy and more individuals supporting local news. I think we'll continue to see nonprofit news growing into more and more markets, but also more rural markets and markets that are harder to crack the nut on how you figure out the strong business model for. I think a lot of these organizations that are building kind of multi-local models where off the same infrastructure they're able to launch in more markets are figuring out the ways that we get to more rural communities. And so I think we're going to see many, many more examples of news organizations not just emerging in higher population markets, but also in more rural markets.
That'd be great. I live in a pretty rural area myself, and I know the struggles of, like you said, more rural areas in the country. So that's great. All right, Sarabeth, this has been awesome. I could probably think of like 5 or 6 more questions to ask, but I have another meeting coming up. Where can people find you online? Anything you want me to link to in the show notes or promote from the AJP? I'd love to hear it.
Sure. You can find us at theajp.org. Encourage you to spend some time with our portfolio to looking at all the different news organizations we support. There's so much to learn from them, and I think it will give folks a sense of the ways in which new models are emerging that are really promising.
That's great. I'll link to that when I go through and edit it. If there's any other stuff you talked about, I'll link to some other resources as well. So, Sarabeth, thank you so much. This was great, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much for taking the time, Paul.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.